Welcome to the Critical Christian Podcast. We're your hosts, Dan
and Justin. We ask critical questions about the Bible and provide questionable answers. Dan, this week we're going to be working in Genesis 25, the latter portion. Let's do 27 through 28. Can you read that?
The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, and Rebekah loved Jacob.
Yeah.
This shows why playing favorites with your children is never a good idea.
I know every parent says they never do that, but let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of happens.
Like, your son is probably your favorite.
Right. He is absolutely my favorite.
Yeah.
It's also true that he's my only child.
Also true.
But I suspect that theoretical here. I'm just speculating, but your question or your comment made me think, like, why would she favor either child?
Right.
I suspect she favored Jacob because every mother wants their child to be close to home. And that's what we see with Jacob. He was probably a mama's boy. He helped out around the house, which is why we see him cooking in verse 29. Traditionally, this was a female task, but Rebekah didn't have any daughters that we know of to help around the house. So this might explain why she favored Jacob and even wanted Jacob to obtain the birthright from Isaac, because she probably felt like Jacob would take better care of her in her older age. We saw the same pattern with Sarah as well when she sent away Ishmael to protect the inheritance of Isaac, who presumably would be the one looking after her in her older age. So it seems this is a case of both preservation, but also because he was the son that was there for me.
Do you think that in those days it was just a given that the wife would outlive the husband?
Yeah, that's funny because there are so many cases in the patriarchal narratives where the husbands live for insane amount of times, but as we get further into Genesis, it appears like some of the women live longer than the men. But do you think maybe that's due to dying in battle, or?
I mean, even nowadays, women live longer than men. So, but it just seems weird that they would spend all their time worrying about how they're going to be taken care of in their old age, when, I mean, their husbands should be taking care of them, right? And the only reason they would need to be taken care of is if they assume their husband is going to die. And I mean, even if he does, I assume they're going to die pretty close together. I mean, the woman isn't going to live for another 20 years, right? Does she really need to worry about this?
Well, so far in the patriarchal narratives, they do have some pretty large age discrepancies at the time of death. Remember, Abraham was 175, and he had time to take another wife after his wife died, and then fathered many children by Keturah. But to your point, though...
And then Keturah would have to be a lot younger if she was able...
Gosh.
Okay, so she probably would actually care about being taken care of. But I don't think Sarah would have.
Nevertheless, though, I mean, to your point, in the ancient Near East... it was somewhat assumed that your husband would die before you.
Why?
So it was very important for your son to be able to take over. But also, just because your husband is still alive doesn't mean that he's all that useful. At a certain point, your body breaks down without modern medicine and care. So even if they're both still living, it could be possible that the two of them need a son to take care of them. But nevertheless, I mean, why do the men die before the women? And I think that's probably because the women stay in the home more often. They don't do a lot of burdensome chores, except for maybe getting the water. But even that was farmed out to the younger members of the household, whereas the men had to go out and they did hunting, farming, and fought with the neighboring territories. right? Even Father Abraham, remember, got into a pretty large skirmish before he met the priest Melchizedek.
Oh, okay.
So anybody could die of war, it seems like, at this time period. Anybody. So
apparently Isaac preferred Esau because he was a good hunter, and Isaac really liked eating meat.
Right.
Which, I mean, that's what it says.
That is precisely what it says. This story has always been weird to me. And the way it was explained to me way back when I was in Catholic school, and seems to be true throughout my time studying in seminary, is that eating meat was not incredibly common for people of this lifestyle, because you usually had to kill off your livestock in order to eat the meat. So when you did have meat, it was because you were giving an offering at a shrine, or even in like a homemade high place.
The only place to get the real stuff is to kill it.
That's right. Now, that is where something interesting comes in, because we're told that Esau was a skilled hunter, which means they had somebody in the family that could go out and hunt wild game. They could get meat without killing their own livestock. So this would have been a really big treat, I'm sure, for the family. We're not told whether or not Rebecca enjoyed having the meat. We have to assume the whole family enjoyed it. But nevertheless, this would have been an unusual skill that lent the household a food source that was not as common, but probably a little bit prized. There's something really interesting with this hunting as well. It said that he's a skilled hunter of the field, which also seems to echo, remember, that of Nimrod.
I remember him.
And Ishmael, who became a skilled bowman. Both these two figures previously were kind of like bad boys in the biblical narrative. And Ishmael was said to have been a skilled hunter and bowman, but also cursed to fight against his brothers, just like Jacob and Esau. Jacob, remember, was going to be served by his brother Esau in his prophecy. So again, we have another point of contact between the Abraham narrative and the Isaac narrative, where they both have sons, and those sons are prophesied to fight against each other. And one of those sons becomes a mighty hunter. So I did list 5 points of contact between the Jacob and Esau narrative and the Isaac Ishmael narrative.
Okay.
Both narratives begin with barrenness. Both women are told specifically by God that they would have some sort of miraculous birth. Both included divided nations that were going to be against each other. Both included the mother as having a favorite son and protecting the status of that son. And both stories had longer narratives in which they became, in which a run-in with Abimelech became kind of a big deal. So it is entirely possible, as you pointed out earlier, that the two narratives between Isaac and Abraham could have stemmed from some sort of a shared oral tradition, or two stories that were so close that details got mixed up. But I still think they stemmed from one tradition that became turned into two traditions because they needed to explain more people groups.
Oh.
Because remember, where did the Edomites come from? Well, shoot, we got to figure that one out.
Here's the thing, though. I mean, everybody comes from somewhere. So wouldn't they have actually known?
I don't think so.
Okay, what if they didn't know? Does it matter?
No.
Who was caring about this?
I don't think people cared whether or not these people existed. I think they assumed it was true, and that's why the people were named what they were. That's why their geographical landmarks got their names. These are literally just origin stories to explain why things are at the time of writing.
Why was that necessary?
Because everyone has questions. I mean, anyone who's ever had a child knows that even something simple as, passing a water tower is going to lend itself questions. What's in the tower? What's it there for? How long has it been there? Why is there something drawn on the side of it? And they're just endless questions. And what do? You got to provide them some answer. I don't know. And then you make something up.
Is this similar to the creation story then?
Yeah, I would say this is similar to the creation story, in which it was originally devised to explain something.
Everybody wanted to know how they came to be. And so the priests were like, well, let's tell them something.
Right.
And then they can shut up.
And like a lot of the stories with the patriarchs, it's very likely that these were some original true stories. Like, these are true narratives about real people, but they were molded during the period of oral transition to serve the needs of the people that were transmitting the stories.
Oral transition, you mean from oral to written?
I mean, just over the course of time.
Oh, okay.
Like telephone.
Right. Got it.
So it's not that these events are completely made up. There probably are a kernel of truth in all of these stories. It's just that over the course of oral tradition, the names, the details, they all get sort of modified to serve the purpose of the storyteller.
So do you think the priests who were writing this down, did they do this because those are the stories that they actually believed, or because they had some sort of agenda?
I'm not entirely convinced that the patriarchal narratives were necessarily made by the priests, but it does seem that there's a political bent towards these narratives. And part of that is to explain why some of these nations are bad people and we fight with them, and why there are 12 nations, seemingly, which we're going to get to. It's not exactly 12, that, we were supposed to be unified. And well, why were we supposed to be unified? Well, because of, the story of Jacob. Because we were all from the same, parents.
That makes sense.
Right. But if we were all from the same parents, where in the world did Edom and Moab and whatnot come from? Well, let me tell you that story.
Yeah.
All right, Dan, can you read 25:30 for us?
Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore his name was called Edom.
That's right. Which does actually mean red.
And so he was called Esau, but then he ate red stew, and they're like, all right, forget it, we're changing his name.
Yeah. Isn't that the funniest thing, is that we were given his name, Esau. We do have a plausible reason why he was named Esau. Is this like a nickname? And I think this, to me, is the explanation why. Okay, first, he is affiliated with Mount Seir, and that makes sense. That fits the translation of his original name. But why is our people group named Edom? Oh, because, this thing happened with this really red stew.
And he really liked it. So they just renamed him.
And to me, that is the only reason why this part would exist in the narrative, is to explain how Edom got its nickname when it seems that the narrative is about Mount, his naming was because of Mount Seir. So anyways, the Edomites were unpopular in Israel, and they, there was some bad blood there.
When in the Bible did they make mention of that?
So the first kind of big to-do happens when the conquest period begins and the Israelites leave Egypt and start to enter into the Promised Land. And they start by coming from the south, which is where Edom is located. So Edom is just south of the Dead Sea. And then they tried to pass through Edom, and the king was like, "Nah, you're not passing through here." And then that is theoretically the cause of the initial bad blood. But they don't start fighting yet.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the first sort of like indicator in the Bible that things aren't going to go well.
Mm-hmm.
They do eventually, later during the conquest period, like during the reign of David, they do actually have actual full-on battles with the Edomites.
Oh. And it all originated with Esau.
Yep.
Maybe. Probably not. All right.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Moabites and the Ammonites do the same exact thing to the Israelites. The Israelites want to pass through, and they're like, nah, we're not doing that.
Okay, I'm assuming none of this happened, and they just needed a reason for the Moabites and the Ammonites. So
they needed a reason to dislike these nations, but actually, I believe that the story of the Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites not allowing Israel to pass through their nations on their way to the conquest, I think might actually be true. Like, in fact, a lot of the Exodus and the conquest narrative, I think happened.
Why?
Because we have a ton of evidence for it in archaeology.
Okay. Well, I look forward to talking about that then.
Yeah, I mean, you know me, I'm like a biblical minimalist. You know, I'm going to read the text at face value, and if there's no proof in history, I'm going to assume that the narrative is well designed.
And I think that's it's good.
Right.
Helps us to actually come to the truth.
I think that's the goal here, right? And so far what we've seen in the book of Genesis up to this point is that the narrative appears to be trying to explain things as they are. But when we get to Exodus, that's going to change drastically. There is a lot of proof that a ton of Semitic-speaking people went into Egypt and then were eventually kicked out. And there's proof for a biblical-sized plague in Egypt and proof that all the cities in Canaan were attacked at roughly the same period by a bunch of most likely Semitic-speaking people that were nomadic.
The Israelites.
Yep. We're definitely going to move here in a couple weeks from explanatory narratives to real history.
So it seems to me as though Genesis largely is just to explain everybody's past.
Yeah, it's a document that attempts to provide a political history of the people groups in the land of Canaan at the time of writing, which is most likely after the time of David, but that's, neither here nor there. And of course, we have similar narratives too, that like mythologies in America, like, was it George Washington cut down the tree, and Abraham Lincoln couldn't tell a lie, or the idea that Washington had wooden teeth. There's so many false narratives in American history, and that was a couple hundred years ago. So why would we think that the ancient people who had even less access to long-term writing methods and whatnot would be any better at,
And I mean, okay, George Washington probably did not have wooden teeth, right?
No, he did not.
But he was a person.
Exactly.
So it's possible these stories are somewhat true.
I think so. I think all of these stories had a kernel of truth somewhere, and then they were just modified throughout oral history to serve the needs of the people. Just like today, in many, many churches throughout the country, the history of America's founding is completely twisted to make it appear like all of the founding fathers were like diehard Christians and they wanted to have a Christian nation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the same exact thing happens with the Bible. It was written during, a period in which they needed to craft a narrative of the founding of Israel.
To get the North and the South together, right?
Part of it, yep. But there's a lot of things they're trying to do with that narrative other than just tell history. They're trying to manipulate a view that gives a future path forward for the nation as well. This is where we came from, and because of this is where we need to go in the future.
That's exactly what the churches are doing then.
That's exactly what the churches are doing to American history, is they're trying to utilize it in order to propagandize, our history.
Which is interesting because we actually have a lot of proof that this is not true. But the Bible, of course, they had nothing else to go on.
Right. How would they know?
Right.
I mean, who's going to give you a dissenting opinion?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they couldn't read. Very few people could read, even if you had access to another text. And there are additional texts that Genesis speaks of. But who's got the text and who's going to read it?
Mm-hmm.
Let's read 25, 31 through 32.
But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." And Esau said, "Look, I am about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" This is one of the most unbelievable lines in the whole Bible, and that's saying something. What circumstances could ever befall someone that without a bowl of soup, they would die immediately?
Right. And I had a thought on this particular question, because I think it's a good question. And I remember the first time I read this particular story, I think I was a freshman in high school. And when I was reading it, I'm like, nah, not going to happen. Never going to happen. No one's ever going to sell their birthright for a bowl of soup. But remember, we're told that Jacob is a man of the tents. It's possible that Esau spent days or even weeks in the field hunting without coming back.
Oh, weeks?
Yeah, he could have gone long periods of time.
It's funny, when I was thinking about it, I'm just like, oh, there's like a woods near their house that he just runs into.
Not quite. No, he's probably on hunting expeditions looking for game. Hunting is not quite as easy as it is today, where you just call up a guy who owns a farm with a bunch of deer and you turn up and shoot them.
Well, I have deer that come in my backyard routinely. So I assumed it would be similar, especially when there were more animals back then, right?
But they live in a rather rocky desert location, which didn't lend itself to a ton of wildlife. So he's probably hunting, rabbits. Yeah, exactly. And there's not a ton of stuff.
Okay.
Nevertheless, it's possible too. First of all, we're assuming here that they're grown.
Mm-hmm.
They're still in the house, but they're grown enough that they can take care of their parents. So it's possible too, just like any young person that might leave their house for a period of time just because they're young and they want the freedom, that he's spending a lot of time out in the fields, just being free, just hunting, just doing his own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you've gone a long time, like multiple days without food. I've passed out in my life twice from hunger. It's also possible that it wasn't hunger. He might have just been exhausted from dehydration. Now remember the story of Ishmael and his mother when they're sent into the desert by Abraham, and they nearly die of dehydration because they only had the one skin of water.
Mm-hmm.
This is relatively the same area that they were in the desert and nearly died. So it's entirely possible that he came back. He was dehydrated. He was hungry. He had been gone for days or even a week or two, and was just, on the edge of death when he came back because he's young and stupid and is pushing his boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is the first time he's pushed himself that far, and he feels weak and he doesn't know what's about to happen. He just knows something bad is about to happen. Right. And so he's in a panic.
You would still think he'd have enough energy to, go to the refrigerator and get his own food instead of asking his brother.
Well, that was another thought, was we don't know for sure that there was other food to be had in the tent. Now, a lot of times you'd have some unleavened bread sitting around or something that you could easily store, like dried meat. But we're not at all told that there is other food to be had. And also, remember, Jacob is the one doing the cooking, helping his mother out. I think that the whole thing was concocted. I think that Jacob knew his brother was going to come back half-starved and famished. Might have been a repeat scenario. He's seen his brother do this before, young and stupid, go out for too long, come back, on the edge of death and dehydration, looking ravenous, trying to find anything he can get to eat. So what does he do? He gets rid of all the food in the tent, sets himself up to make a delicious stew, and you could just smell it, as he's coming back from the field. I think this was a plan by Jacob all along to take the birthright.
It's odd because it's not like it was Jacob's stew. I mean, it was the family stew, right?
That's a good point. Was he making it for the family or just for this occasion? We're not really told.
Would it matter? I mean, anything he used was, it would have been Isaac's, right?
Yeah, I would imagine so. It would seem that way.
I mean, how can you say, give me your birthright, I'll give you the stew, even though none of this belongs to me. It really belongs to my father.
I see what you're saying there. And I think the problem is that, we're just not told. There are details. What was he cooking that stew for himself or for the family? Or was he doing it just deviantly in order to take the birthright? We just don't have answers because the text doesn't tell us.
Right. I know it.
It'd be nice if they gave us lots of detail. Apparently it wasn't important to the narrator. But to your point that you wrote down, what kind of a low life does this to his brother? I don't have a whole lot to say on that, except that it's pretty low. I mean, it's hard for me to understand why this man was blessed by God for behaving in such a way.
Right.
Which is maybe why the narrator paints Esau and his descendants in a negative light, because they need to make Jacob somehow justified in his actions.
But there is no justification. I don't like this part where it seems like there are a lot of bad people that get blessed by God for no reason other than because apparently it moves the narrative along.
Right.
And that really feels like what's going on here. If I had to guess, now that I think about it, I would say that God probably isn't very happy about this piece either, because it's not true and it doesn't paint God in a good light. And God definitely wouldn't have done what they purport him to have done.
Yeah. Although, we're not told at this point in the story yet that Jacob's a good person.
Right.
It's not until he meets Elohim at was it Bethel? And when he promises to go into covenant with God, says, if you take care of me and protect me and so on and so forth, I'll come back here and give you a tenth of everything. So it's not entirely clear that the narrator is even suggesting he's a good person yet, but that maybe later when he does swear his oath to God, that God forgives him and says, okay, if you're going to walk with me, let's do it. But to your point, it's a strange thing because in the narrative, it says that Esau will serve Jacob, which presupposes the fact that Jacob will be blessed. The question becomes, how active is God in the everyday life of an individual in that he's going to manipulate an outcome, even though you're the one using your free will to choose it.
Right.
God does intervene in the affairs of humanity, but does not necessarily orchestrate the events of all humanity. Now let's read 25, 33 through 34.
But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So Esau was so close to death that he ate some soup, had a little bread, and he was just like, all right, I'm going to bounce on out of here. I almost feel as though it was written as a slight against Esau, as if to show how stupid he was and how undeserving of the birthright he was. Like we're supposed to applaud Jacob's cunning and trickery.
Right. I think you're kind of dead nuts on. In fact, there's like a biblical theme throughout the Old Testament, not just of the lesser son overcoming the older, larger son, but by doing it with wit and trickery and wiles. We see this also with some of the stories about the women of the Bible, like Jael in the book of Judges, how she tricks somebody from an opposing army and then ends up murdering them and delivering their head. And then, of course, we see also in the Deuterocanonical book of Judith, something very similar happening with the death of Holofernes. But I say all that to say this: the use of wiles and trickery in the Old Testament is usually perceived as being a good thing, not a bad thing. And it's almost always used in a method in which somebody who is smaller and weaker or lesser than somebody overcomes somebody that's older, more powerful, so on and so forth. So anyways, to your point, yeah, there's some trickery here, but I think according to the narrative and the author, it might not be necessarily a bad thing.
Do you think it's just our modern sensibilities?
Yes. I think in the modern age, we view that type of behavior as devious or untruthful in a way. Mm-hmm. But according to the biblical authors, not so much. But nevertheless, in the Bible, this type of trickery is almost always kind of commended. Mm-hmm. You know, think about the trick that Joseph played on his brothers to get a confession out of them.
Oh, yeah, right. And we're going to be getting into that pretty soon.
Real soon. One last thought. You had mentioned that this passage seems to suggest that Esau was kind of undeserving of his birthright. And I would say, yeah, a resounding yes to that. They do kind of paint Esau here as, well, maybe he didn't deserve it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
And now we feel good for Jacob and cheer him on.
Right. It's almost like the narrative is trying to quietly move your opinion. Mm-hmm. But yeah. I think they both come off looking terribly.
Yeah.
So next week, we're going to be talking about the next run-in with Abimelech.
And then chapter 27, we get right back to Jacob and Esau.
Almost like that narrative shouldn't be stuffed in there.
Almost. Yeah.
Seems misplaced to me.
A little bit.
Anachronism.
Shocking.
Oh, well. Well, next week, we're going to have lots of fun with Isaac and Abimelech and Rebecca.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get to 27 as well, because it doesn't seem like there's much in this.
I mean, we'll see when we get there. It seems like there's less in chapter 26 because we've already seen it twice.
Right.
Nevertheless, thanks for watching. We appreciate all of our viewers. If you have any comments or questions or even criticisms, please feel free to leave those in the comments. Until next time, like and subscribe.
Dismissed. 25:30. Oh. 25:30. But Jacob said, "Sell me your."